All right, so today, let's take a deep dive into a piece of legal history that you really wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
It's called Van Staphorst v. Maryland, and it
Interesting case.
really is fascinating.
Yeah.
This was the very first case that the Supreme Court ever agreed to hear.
Yeah, back in 1791.
Back in 1791.
It's hard to imagine the Supreme Court, kind of just getting started.
And get this.
Yeah.
It was all about a Revolutionary War debt that never even made it to arguments.
It really is a story that I think is often overlooked because it's not, one of these big landmark cases.
Right.
But it's about two Dutch brothers, Nicolaas and Jacob Ben Staphorst, and how they ended up in a legal battle with the entire state of Maryland.
The whole state, yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
We're working from excerpts of the Wikipedia entry on this case. And, sometimes these lesser-known stories are the most intriguing.
Oh, absolutely. And this one's a great example.
So it all starts in 1781, right in the middle of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
And Maryland, as you can imagine, is strapped for cash.
War's expensive.
Yeah. So they send this guy, Thomas Ridley, over to Europe to try to drum up some loans.
That's right. He's sent to find investors, basically people, to lend Maryland money to help support the war effort.
And that's where these Van Staphorst brothers come in.
Exactly. There were these prominent financiers in Holland, really well respected.
Oh, so they had money to lend.
They had money to lend and they saw an opportunity, right?
Uh-huh.
The American Revolution, very risky, but potentially a big payoff if things went well.
A good investment, maybe.
Right, a calculated risk.
So Ridley strikes a deal with them.
Okay.
They lend money to Maryland.
Uh-huh.
Maryland promises to repay with tobacco at a set price.
Seems simple enough, right?
Sounds pretty straightforward.
You would think so. But there's a catch, and this is where it gets interesting.
Okay, what's the catch?
Well, this was a commodity-based loan, meaning the repayment was tied to the price of tobacco.
Oh, okay.
And tobacco prices could be very volatile, especially during a war.
Oh, yeah, makes sense.
Supply and demand, all that stuff.
So what about these hogsheads I keep seeing in the agreement?
Yes, the hogsheads. Well, a hogshead is basically like a big barrel.
Okay.
Used for shipping things like tobacco.
Okay, I gotcha.
And here's where the Van Staphorst brothers were really clever. Part of the deal said that they would buy 1,000 hogsheads of tobacco from Maryland as interest,
Okay.
regardless of how much interest actually accrued.
Wait, so they were guaranteed a certain amount of tobacco no matter what?
Exactly. And any extra tobacco they got, well, they could just resell it at the market price.
So they could actually make a profit?
Potentially a big one.
Wow, that's pretty smart.
They knew what they were doing.
But didn't anyone think about what would happen to tobacco prices after the war?
Well, it's easy to look back and say they should have known.
Right.
But at the time, it was very uncertain. Nobody could predict how much the market would change.
I guess so.
And remember, Maryland was desperate. They needed that money.
Right. They had to take the deal.
Pretty much.
And the market did change. Like a lot, right?
Oh, yeah. Big time. The war and demand for American tobacco just exploded. And those fixed prices they agreed on suddenly looked like a steal for the Van Staphorst brothers.
Yeah. I bet Maryland was kicking themselves.
Oh, I'm sure they were now stuck selling their tobacco at a fraction of what it was actually worth.
So what did they do?
Well, they tried to renegotiate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they claimed that they hadn't actually received the full loan amount from the brothers.
Trying to get out of the deal?
Kind of. But the Van Staphorsts, they weren't budging. A deal's a deal, they said.
Wow.
And so it began this long back and forth.
Years of fighting over this.
Yeah, failed negotiations, rejected proposals, even attempts at arbitration. It went on and on.
But Maryland was making some payments, right?
Yes, they were, but not directly to the Van Staphorst brothers. They were sending the money to their agents.
Why does that matter if the money was getting paid?
Well, it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle. The Van Staphorst brothers felt that Maryland was deliberately bypassing them, trying to undermine their authority.
Like they weren't being respected.
Exactly. It was a matter of respect, of acknowledging their position as lenders.
Wow.
And this desire for recognition, well, it led them to take a very bold step.
What did they do?
They decided to go to the highest court in the land.
Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court.
Wow.
It was a huge deal. It's 1790, and the U.S. has a brand new Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
And the Van Staphorst brothers, they feel like they've been wronged. So they decide to take their case to the highest court in the land.
Talk about a power move.
Yeah, they really upped the ante.
This was the first case the Supreme Court ever agreed to hear, right?
The very first one.
Can you imagine that pressure?
I mean, a brand new institution trying to establish its authority.
Right.
And their first case is this huge international financial dispute.
Kind of war debt.
Yeah, a war debt and a fight over how payments should be made.
So it's 1791, and Maryland gets summoned to appear in Philadelphia.
Sounds right. February 1791.
Was the whole nation watching this case?
Well, we don't know for sure about the public's reaction.
Okay.
But we do know that the case never actually went to trial.
Wait a minute. All that drama? All those years of fighting?
Uh-huh.
And they settled out of court.
They did.
Come on, what happened?
Well, the Wikipedia entry doesn't say exactly what the settlement was.
Oh, no. Come on.
But that silence is actually pretty interesting.
Okay, how so?
Think about it. Maryland chose to settle before the case even got to arguments.
Uh-huh.
That tells us something about how much power people already saw in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Even though it was brand new,
Right.
the threat of a Supreme Court ruling,
Uh-huh.
a decision that could set a precedent for future cases,
Right.
that was enough to bring Maryland back to the negotiating table.
So the Van Staphorst brothers basically forced their hand by going to the Supreme Court,
Exactly.
even though the court didn't actually have to rule on anything.
That's the power of the judiciary. It's a separate branch of government that can hold even states accountable.
It's incredible how much impact a case can have, even if it doesn't go to trial.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the power of precedent.
Uh-huh.
How just the possibility of a ruling can shape how legal matters are handled.
So we've got these two Dutch brothers
Right.
taking on a whole state over a Revolutionary War debt
And it becomes this landmark case.
that ends in a secret settlement
Right.
and helps establish the Supreme Court's authority right from the beginning.
Pretty amazing story, right?
It is fascinating, but why should our listeners care about this old legal battle?
Well, Van Staphorst v. Maryland isn't just about a debt.
Go.
It's a glimpse into the foundations of our legal system.
Oh, I see.
How the power is balanced between states and the federal government.
Right.
And the lasting impact of the American Revolution.
It shows that history isn't just something in a textbook.
Exactly.
It's about real people with complex motivations.
And how seemingly small events can have huge ripple effects.
Who would have thought a fight over tobacco could shape the American legal system?
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
So before we wrap up, I have to ask, do you think the Van Staphorst brothers got their tobacco?
I wish I knew.
Or did they get something else entirely?
Unfortunately, the historical record doesn't say.
Oh, man.
We don't know the terms of the settlement, what they had to give up, or what they got in return.
That's too bad. It would be so interesting to know how it all ended.
I agree.
I guess some mysteries just stay mysteries.
But sometimes that mystery makes the story even more intriguing.
You've got a point there. You know, we've been talking a lot about the Van Staphorst brothers.
Yeah,
But what about Maryland?
that's a good point.
What was their side of the story?
It's easy to focus on the underdog, the little guy fighting the big bad state.
Right.
But Maryland had their own reasons for doing what they did.
So let's put ourselves in Maryland's shoes.
Okay.
Brand new state, just starting out trying to finance a war.
Right. And desperate for money.
I bet they felt a lot of pressure to get those loans,
Absolutely any way they could.
even if it meant agreeing to tough terms.
Especially when you consider who they were dealing with.
The Van Staphorst brothers.
Yeah, these were seasoned European financiers.
Oh, so they knew how to make deals.
They knew how to structure a loan.
So Maryland might have felt a little outmatched.
Possibly, especially when those tobacco prices shot up.
And they realized what they had signed up for.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about fairness in contracts.
Hmm.
Should a deal always be kept even if things change drastically?
That's a tough question.
Or is there room to renegotiate when something unexpected happens?
Legal scholars have debated that for ages.
So what are the arguments?
Well, on one side, you have the principle of pacta sunt servanda.
Which means,
Agreements must be kept.
okay,
It's a fundamental part of contract law.
makes sense. You need to be able to trust that people will keep their word.
Right. Otherwise, business would be chaos.
But on the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
it seems unfair to hold someone to a deal that's become totally one-sided.
Because of something they couldn't have predicted,
Yeah.
that's where things get tricky.
So where's the line?
When is a change big enough to justify renegotiating or even breaking a contract?
There are no easy answers.
Not at all.
I guess that's why we have courts,
Exactly.
to sort out these complicated issues
And try to find a balance.
between what's legally binding and what's actually fair,
Right.
and Van Staphorst v. Maryland.
Even though it was never decided.
Right.
It gives us this fascinating historical example.
Of how messy things can get.
Yeah, trying to balance those legal obligations with the realities of the situation.
It's a reminder that the law isn't just a bunch of rules
It has to adapt and evolve.
to deal with the complexities of real life.
Absolutely.
And sometimes the cases that never go to trial
Uh-huh.
are the ones that make us think the hardest
They force us to confront these fundamental questions
about fairness and justice.
and the very nature of agreements.
So there you have it. Van Staphorst v. Maryland.
A case that never was
But still had a big impact.
on the early Supreme Court.
And it still raises questions.
About contracts, fairness, and the consequences of agreements made long ago.
It shows us that history is never really over.
There's always more to discover.
More perspectives to consider.
And new questions to ask.
Who knows, maybe somewhere out there,
Yeah,
there's a box full of documents.
that could solve the mystery of that settlement.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
It would be fascinating to see what really happened.
Until then, we just have to keep searching.
And keep exploring the world of legal history.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
My pleasure.